So welcome, Shaka. I am really curious if instead of asking people what they do for a living, I really like to understand like what your purpose is. So you can kind of explain to us, what your main mission and purpose is at this point in life.
So my purpose in life right now is to really create a space where we can have honest dialogue about mass incarceration. We have 2.5 million men and women who are incarcerated, and we're not having honest discussions about what takes place in prison, what can prevent more men and women from going to prison, and what should happen with men and women when they're released from prison. So I'm very driven. I'm very passionate about elevating this conversation in public spaces and including the community in a real transparent and honest way. When I think back to my teenage years, I struggled through some issues that a lot of the young men and women who I work with, who I mentor with, a feeling of not being truly loved by my mother, not being supported in my visions and my dreams and goals that I had for myself, not having teachers who really understood some of the things I was experiencing and going through. And I think those things are crucial to a child's development. Like, children need to have cheerleaders and advocates who care about them and care about their interests and their visions and dreams. And I believe that had those things been in place, my path would have been a lot different.
And looking back at high school, is there anything that you wish you had available to you while you were going to school?
Yes, I honestly, it's one of the things that I talk about a lot in my work, and that I think that a lot of children who are growing up in inner cities need is mentors who come from where they come from. Mentors who may not have taken traditional paths, but who have learned from their past mistakes, their past misdeeds, and who have a wealth of information that they can share to young men and women who may be struggling with issues of parental neglect, abuse, child abuse, substance abuse, drug abuse. I really wish I had somebody who could have stepped in and saw my potential, and who would have been able to help me cultivate and nurture the best in myself.
And as we look today, it's so easy for teens to have access to buy guns online in just minutes and fairly inexpensively. What are some of your suggestions for gun control in America?
That's a very difficult one, because what I found growing up in the inner city, that you can buy a gun relatively easy for a little bit to no money. And so my thing about gun prevention is really about raising awareness amongst teens about the impact of carrying guns as it relates to gun rights activists and advocates and things of that nature. I think that there should be more responsible gun laws, and not just the gun laws, but actually the selling of ammunition and things like that. I think that we need to be more conscious about those type of things. But on a more personal level, I think that we have to raise the awareness in our children, and not limit it to children who grew up in the country or who may be raised to hunt and things like that. But I think that urban inner city kids should be raised with a high sense of gun awareness and the long and far-reaching implications of gun violence and just gun safety, period. We have so many tragedies where parents have left guns unattended and caused the death when children find and discover them without understanding the impact and power that they're holding in their hands.
And when we look at prisons in the U.S., we're finding more and more jails are privately owned. Do you believe that crime is actually being created on purpose?
I think that fairness and sentencing disparities are created on purpose, and it's largely because we live in a society where certain segments of the community have been criminalized just by their pure existence. You think about how black males and brown males are portrayed in the media, and the ominous threat that they're stigmatized to carry. In reality, that's not the case for the majority of young men and women growing up in these communities. And so in that way, I think that it has created a very unjust system in terms of how they're treated. When we look at sentencing disparities in, for example, the drug laws, at one point was a 500-to-1 ratio in terms of crack compared to powder cocaine. That's been reduced to 18-to-1, but it's still not fair. And so in that way, I think there has been a conspiracy to incarcerate young black males and young brown males. And when you look at school test scores and what's happening in the school, I think it starts in that space. And there are companies who benefit from this relatively free labor. I mean, when I was in prison, I worked at one point for 17 cents an hour, and the way that that's justified is through the 13th Amendment, which states that slavery should be prohibited except for those who have been duly convicted of a crime. And that's one of the parts of the amendment that a lot of people aren't aware of, and it justifies and it legalizes the enslavement or poor, underprivileged, youth who grow up in these environments.
And looking at a relatively current situation that just happened in our country, how can communities come together to prevent police officers from really abusing power, as the example we saw with the case of Michael Brown in Ferguson?
I think the community's reaction, coming out protesting, standing up and saying that, this will not be tolerated. But I think that it takes more than just those people who live in the community, because they're not the only people who pay those officers to work in those communities. I think that we have to be honest across the board. I think that anytime any of our children are murdered by those who are paid to protect and serve, I think that should outrage all of us. And I think that change only takes place when people come together collectively. I think people who live in affluent areas, who have influence and power and political power, I believe that when they can engage the officers and really help them to understand what's taking place in the community, I think that's when change takes place. And so I would love to see more white males and white women and middle class and working class people come out and support these people who are living in these underprivileged and underserved communities and take a real stand, a human stand, because at the end of the day, Mike Brown represents any of our children. And I think that once we can start seeing each other's children as our children collectively, we can make a real change. And so protesting is really important. Being in control of media, like that's one of the great things about social media, is that we weren't just left to trust the big media outlets to tell the story of Ferguson and to tell the story of Mike Brown, because had we trusted that media, then we would have been dealing with what we dealt with for years, is the criminalization of a young man who was innocently gunned down. And so I think we have to continue to use media, continue to use video, continue to use our voices, come together collectively and process when we're not satisfied with outcomes.
And you just brought up something interesting that made me think here. Is it just as important to be proactive as it is to be reactive in situations like this?
I think it's even more important to be proactive. I think that we have to take this moment to really think about what are strategies that we can employ collectively as people, and absent the political system, but as human beings, to say, if you're going to work in these communities, here are the standards that must be met in order for you to work in these communities. You can't police a community where you don't care about the people that you're policing. And you can't police a community when you make automatic assumptions based on a person's appearance. To me, that's low-level thinking, and I think that we should stand collectively and say we've had enough of that. Like, no child should be left murdered in the street by a person who is paid to protect them. And I don't think that a child's color, skin tone, dress code should be the determining factor in whether they live and die when they encounter a police officer or whether they encounter anybody else. And we've had far too many instances for this to be considered an isolated incident. Within a week, we had, I think it was 4 young men murdered who were unarmed. And we see this scenario play out over and over again in inner city communities.
And what are the top 4 reasons why teens are becoming more susceptible to engage in drug dealings, gangs, and other detrimental activities?
I think at the top of the list is poverty. Poverty drives drug culture, drives black markets in every way imaginable. And when we think about that, we think of the high unemployment rates. We think about the trickle-down effect of living in a capitalist society, where the reality is you're always going to have some segment of society unemployed, and they're going to find alternative routes to make money. We live in a very materialistic society where media outlets pander the idea of success as being very materialistic. We have so many of these kids who are growing up in environments that are dysfunctional, parents who may not be able to afford the trendy things that children identify with. And for the most case, like in my scenario, most of the kids that I know who get sucked into the drug trade, they get sucked in at a very early age, are more seasoned, charismatic street hustlers. And I think we have to do a better job at protecting our children. We have to create safe passages for them to get out of that culture. I know when I sold drugs, one of the hardest things for me to do was walk away from it. And unfortunately, you know, I ended up serving a very lengthy prison system before I was able to turn things around. And one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about my work with young men and women is because I wish there would have been an adult in that environment who would have stepped up and said, you know, this is wrong. And that just wasn't the case. And so we have to be more proactive in protecting our, you know, our basically they're our babies. You know, when you look at somebody who's 14 and they're sucked into a very dysfunctional adult subculture, it should be an outrage to any adult. You know, like I can't even imagine at this age now when I look at the young men and women I work with, I can't even imagine giving them anything that will cause them harm or, you know, put them in harm's way. And, you know, we don't do enough of that in school. You know, we kick kids out for the smallest things, you know, and what happens is when you kick a kid out of school for a minor infraction in their home for 3 days and their parents are at work, that makes them susceptible and it makes them very vulnerable to older, more seasoned street hustlers.
Yeah, and I believe one of the things that you've said is our worst deeds do not define us. But it seems like the system, you know, has determined that it does. So what do you think needs to be done in order to give job opportunities to people with a criminal record and prevent them from committing crimes again in order to be able to really have a chance to survive?
You know, I think of it in terms of return on investment. So we live in a society where we have 2.5 million men and women who are incarcerated, costing roughly around $30,000 a year to incarcerate. So when you think about that, over the course of 20 years, if somebody's being incarcerated for that length of time, that's a major investment. We're talking about over $600,000 or close to $1 million for 20 years. And to have that person come out of prison the same way they went in is just a horrible investment strategy. And so I think that we have to rethink our position on how we deal with men and women who are incarcerated. If you're going to incarcerate somebody as a nation, I think our responsibility is to ensure that when these men and women return to the community, that they have ample employment opportunities, educational opportunities, the opportunity to vote, because regardless of when and where they come home, they're going to be returned to our communities. They're going to either be taxpaying citizens or they're going to resort back to a lifestyle that's going to provide, you know, provide the basic necessities of life. And I just think we've done a horrible job at it. We warehouse more men and women than any other nation in the world. And it's tragic to know that we live in a society that's so technologically advanced, but when it comes to mass incarceration, we have failed horribly. And that practice isn't healthy. It isn't healthy for the community who these men and women will return to. It isn't healthy for taxpayers who's going to foot the bill over and over again when we have a 70% recidivism rate. And we just have to rethink our strategy.